The doctrine of separation of power, it has been interpreted by different people in their own portion without being specific for real. What does it really mean? Everybody talks about separation of power in his own way, but have you ever asked about talking about separation of power is tracing its roots, or you just talk about it in its own way? When somebody is limited to vote, talks about separation of power. When somebody is limited to move, talks about separation of power. We don't know what's the opinion about this. However, separation of power historically, for it, this is the doctrine that was brought up by the philosophers in 80s. Philosopher was Montesquieu. I think by that time we had the revolution in France in 1789, whereby by that time we had a lot of monarchies in Europe, whereby these monarchies, for them, they used to exercise the executive powers, legislative powers. For them, they were the law. For example, the monarchy of France in early 70s and 60s, actually in 15th century there, yeah, it was the law. How is it? It came up with the law. It exercised judicial powers. It exercised executive powers. There was no any separation of power. Remember Montesquieu in his book Spirit of the Law. There's where he wrote and he said that any society that do not follow or respect separation of power and human rights, there an individual has no what we call liberty. Meaning that if at all you don't have, if at all the three arms of the government are in one man, there is no liberty, according to Montesquieu. But what is separation of power according to these philosophers that brought this? Let's first leave our understanding that we understand it in our normal way, and we dive in and we see how did the philosophers came up with this. According to philosopher Montesquieu in his book The Spirit of Law, for him he contended that at least we should have the three arms of the government. We should have the government whereby when you have an organ that makes the law. Which organ is that? It's the legislature. And you have an organ that executes the law, which is the executive. And it talked about the organ that interprets and mediates the law. It interprets to us the law and it mediates it, which is judiciary. It means that any government that was following what we call the rule of law, that government or the government that was separate following the law, in that government we should have what we call those three organs separated. Montesquieu never ended here by talking about this. He went he dived it into deep by talking about this. Montesquieu talked about that if at all we are to come up with these three organs in the government, each organ should operate by different people. If at all I'm working in the judiciary, when I'm Chief Justice, I'm not supposed to be an MP working in the legislature. If at all I'm working in the legislature, I have to work in the legislature. I should not participate in the parliament or executive. That was according to philosopher Montesquieu. Number two, Montesquieu say that each organ should be working independently without working with any other. If it's the judiciary, it should work independently. It should be independent. It should work independently. If it's the legislature, it should work independently. That was according to Montesquieu. Montesquieu went ahead by 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 contending that no any organ of the state should be taken over or should be controlled by any other organ. This meant that if at all we are in the state, we should not have an organ that should control any other. For example, the executive should not control the judiciary, or the judiciary should not control the executive, or it should not control the legislature. That was according to Professor Montesquieu. Professor Montesquieu, actually, we had even an interesting case of Major David Chinyemfunza versus Attorney General. That case of 1997, whereby Justice Kanyehamba or Professor Kanyehamba brought a decision on separation of power